And what we're doing today is we're going to have a look at some of the moths that we found at a survey I ran here last night. Just before we get around to doing that, I'll just do a bit of context setting. So I'm David Houghton and I'm broadcasting here on HAPS. It goes out to other places, but probably the best way to interact with these broadcasts is to join on HAPS using the link which should be in the description of the broadcast, or streams as apparently we're meant to now call them. And I'm down here at Perivale Wood, which is a nature reserve in northwest London, a little bit of ancient woodland, some paddocks, some meadowland, and it's a place where there's been surveys of various forms of wildlife, Lepidoptera, moths, butterflies, particularly relevant to today's context. And we've been surveying for those species here since the early 1960s. See, I've not been doing that. Other people were doing that at that point in time. And last night I was down here and carried out a variety of different surveys. The methods we used included some light trapping. That's probably the main method we use, and that's a method where we use a bright light source. Moths are famously attracted to light, at least many of the species are. And that bright light sits on top of a box with some sort of funnel apparatus typically on top. The idea being that the insects are attracted to the light, they drop into the box, and then first thing this morning, around about sunrise, which was about just before 6 a.m. today, I go around those traps and I see what's in there, and that way I get to survey and learn about what species of moth are occurring here on this reserve, and add to that data and add to the national recording. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and talk about some of those a bit later. The other method we used last night was something called sugaring, a more traditional method, and it involves boiling up some sugar and some beer and some treacle and so on, and smearing that on trees to attract things. That only succeeded in attracting one moth last night, which is one of the copper underwings. I'll mention that when we come to it. And this is a bit of an experiment for how we're going to do this here on HAPS today. I've previously tried to do this sort of showing the moths live using a separate camera, and that sometimes runs into bandwidth issues and produces quite low quality images that people have said haven't always really let them see what they're looking at. So what I'm going to do today, what I've done today differently, because it's been for most of today rather a dull, grey, wet and miserable day. So I've basically stayed indoors here and taken some photographs and uploaded those photographs to HAPS. So we will look at those, talk about some of the species that we've seen. All of the photographs I'm going to show are the specimens from this reserve from the traps in the session last night. So none of them are images from other occasions. So it's authentic in the same way as if we were actually looking at pictures of them down a live camera. But hopefully the quality will be a little bit better than it's been on some of the other broadcasts where bandwidth issues have just made it difficult. So that's what we're doing, and we will go and start to have a look at some of the pictures now. I just need to remember how to do this. So that will bring up a picture of a moth, and then I will swap the images around to make the moth, which is the more interesting thing, the main image, rather than me. And we'll talk about what the various species are as we go through them. And I will talk about. So this is quite an impressive, quite a large species. The ruler down the left-hand side of this image, and the ruler we're going to show in all of these, the divisions are 1 millimeter large, 1 millimeter division. So that'll give you a sense of the wing size. And this is a Jersey tiger moth. It's a scientific name coming up in a moment as well. Euplagia quadripunctaria. The quadripunctaria probably refers to those sort of approximately 4 lines running across the wing. And this is a species that is a fairly recent colonist here in the London area. It's not a species that was here perhaps 10, 15 years ago. And it started to be seen in some of the stations, particularly some of the railway stations. People were picking it up, perhaps because they had lights on all night, south of the River Thames, and it's expanded from there and really is now quite a common species. I get quite a lot of them. We don't really know how it arrived. There's two theories, if you want. One is that a small number of these, but enough to form a breeding population, just managed to get here. It's quite a large moth. It's quite strongly flying. That's possible. The other is that there was some attempt by people to introduce them, and they were released into the wild. People bred them and released some, and the populations expanded from that. This example here, although you can't tell in the picture I've taken here, has a fairly pale yellow hindwing. And that's a form of this species called Form lutescens. And in the London populations of this moth, that form with the paler yellow hindwing rather than the orangey red hindwing that's more typical occurs at a much greater frequency than it does in lots of other populations. And again, that is suggested that may mean that this is a species that this is a small population and you've got a bit of a founder effect going on where you've got a bit of a genetic bottleneck and relative lack of diversity in the genome, and that's why you're getting a higher proportion of this form. So that's certainly possible. Certainly an interesting species. I say 20 years ago, no way I would have got one of these here. Probably even 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have got one of these here. It is a really quite an attractive species, and now is remarkably common. It's probably one of the commonest things I get asked about by people who know I do moths. They say, I've found this really weird thing. What is it? Or I found this really weird thing. I've read my book and it says it doesn't occur in London. I've found something really rare. And that was a little disappointing when I say, well, that's no longer the case. Anyway, let's take that one off. That's the wrong way to do that. Let's take that off and bring the next moth up. And this is another reasonably large size moth. This is a very common species. This is the large yellow underwing, or Noctua pronuba. Again, folded up like this, you can't see that it's got a bright yellow underwing, but the wing behind these forewings is bright yellow, and that is probably in part a form of protection from predators, a form of startle camouflage, or startle, either to startle things by flashing a bright colour at them. Also, when in flight, you see the yellow, it stands out as a really obviously yellow thing. And then when it drops in and sits like this, that yellow is not there. So something that's got the search image of the yellow, when it's trying to find this after it's dropped to the ground, is going to be a bit confused. One of the commonest moths that we get in our traps. And one of the ones that is quite active and quite strongly flying around in the trap, bats around quite a lot, and we sometimes give this the joke name of the Blunder Wing. Again, I think it was only one of them in the traps, but it's a common species, occurs regularly, feeds on a wide variety of foodstuffs and plants, and again, that's often the way with the common species, that they have a wide variety of things that they feed on. And the next image I'm going to bring up and make the main image. And this was probably the thing I was most excited by in the reserve, in the traps last night. And this is a species called the mocker, or also known as Cyclophora Angularia. And this is the first time this species has been recorded from this site, which, given we've been recording here reasonably intensively for large periods of it since the early 1960s, it's always interesting when we still manage to add new species to the reserve. And new species that quite possibly are genuinely breeding here, genuinely present on the reserve and using it rather than just passing through as sort of rare migrants. So this species feeds as a caterpillar on field maple, a tree field maple, and possibly on other species in the genus Acer, which includes the sycamore. We do have a bit of field maple on the site. We have very little sycamore. So it is possible that this species is living here and is on the reserve and genuinely part of our ecosystem, rather than it just having turned up as a bit of a migrant. Hard to tell. But I was very happy to see that. I'm always happy when I get to add another new species to the reserve that I haven't seen previously. Well, I haven't seen previously here anyway. So that's the mocha. Definitely one of the ones I was happiest to see here on the reserve, and definitely something I'm going to be enjoying. So we'll move on. We'll have a look at some more. So I'll put up 2 images of the next one. Might need to fight slightly with the HAPS setup, but if I do that, and then if I make, well, we'll just do it that way, I think. So this moth is called the orange swift. I'll put the scientific name up there, Triodia sylvina. The swift moths are a fairly primitive group of moths. They're fairly early evolved in the evolution of moths. And that primitive nature shows up in a couple of ways. Partly structurally, for people who are familiar with a group of insects called caddisflies, which are quite one of the closer related groups of insects to moths. You might think that this looks a bit caddisfly-like structurally. That's debatable, but it can be seen to have that impression. The other ways in which they are quite primitive species is that their mouth parts, most moths, people might know, have a curled proboscis, essentially a little tube that curls out of their mouth and that they use to drink liquids, nectars particularly. In the UK, I think nearly all of them are nectar drinkers if they feed as adults. So, but in these swift moth species, the mouth parts are a bit more primitive, and they, as I understand it, they grind up pollen grains and feed on that rather than drinking nectar. And the other way that they are quite primitive is in their egg-laying behaviour. They don't particularly position their eggs anywhere. They don't particularly go and find somewhere and carefully put the eggs down like some species do. Instead, what these species do is they just fly over grassland and scatter the eggs out of the back of the female. So quite a primitive moth in that way, quite undeveloped in certain ways, but survived. So they obviously fit evolutionarily into the niche that they are from. Otherwise, they would have been under selective pressure to evolve differently. So let's have a look at what we've got next. What's going on there? Oh, okay, just give me a second. That hasn't taken that image off. And the next species, and this is a relatively small species. Let me just make it the bigger image on the screen for you. And this is a species called the water veneer, Acentria ephemerella. And a few interesting things about this species. One is that it's one of a small number of moths that have what's called a semi-aquatic larva. So the caterpillars of this live in the water. They essentially make a little cell of vegetation, stitch it together with silk, and they live in that. So they can't breathe underwater. They do need access to the air to breathe, but they are living in that aquatic environment. And that's fairly unusual in Lepidoptera. There are a few species that do it, several of them in this family. It's a pyralid, I think. But they have this semi-aquatic larval stage. Another interesting thing about this is that the females are often, but not always, wingless. So there are two forms of the females, essentially a wingless form that can't fly and a winged form that looks like the males that can fly. This is probably a male. So again, that's interesting. That winglessness does happen in various groups of Lepidoptera. This is one of them where it occurs. And the other thing about this species, and it might be that the scientific name will give you a clue, as will the words written under the scientific name, but the specific name, the species name of this is Ephemerella, so it sounds like ephemeral, and it's given that name because they survive a really short time as adults. When they come out of their pupal stage, they fly around, and typically they'll be dead by the next morning. They'll have found each other, they'll have mated, the females will have laid eggs, and they'll die off. Lots of moth species have fairly short lives in the adult stage, in the flight stage, but these are particularly short-lived. And quite often, most often, in fact, if I find these in the moth traps and in the survey equipment we use, these ones are found dead because they've only got that really short life cycle, and by the morning when I'm going through the trap, they're finished. This one was just still alive, but not at all common for them to be that. They're often dead. We'll move on to the next one. So this species, this is one where we don't actually know at the moment which species it is. It's one of two. And this is one of the species that, one of the moths that came, well, the species, a moth of this type was one of the ones that came to the entomological sugar that we put out, that sticky stuff we put on trees to attract the moths rather than the light traps. This one I'm showing you is actually one from the light trap. It happened to be the one I fished out to photograph. And it's one of the copper underwing species, one of the species in the genus Amphipyra. It's either Amphipyra pyramidea, which is called the copper underwing, or Amphipyra berbera, which is called the Svensson's copper underwing. There's a couple of ways to tell them apart. The most reliable way, as it nearly always is with Lepidoptera, is to dissect them and look at their genitals. But if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to kill them, or if you find faffing around looking insect genitals rather fiddly, the other way is the pattern on the underside of the hindwing. I haven't had a go at looking at that one yet to see which one it is, so that's something I'm going to do probably tomorrow. I'll anesthetize it and have a look at the underside of the hindwing and see which species it is. But it's one of those two, Pyramidea or berbera. They are both common species. They both occur on this site. They both fly at the same time. They look rather similar. They come to the same light sources. They come to sugar in the same way. They are presumably do have ecological differences between them because they're different species. So that's one I will have to spend a bit of time tomorrow working out which species that is. And then a few more to look at still, quite a few. So this is one that often causes confusion to people when it's first seen. People, when they start to get into mothing and the study of moths, will often find this species. And they will go to their moth identification guides And they will look at the shape of it and they will think, well, this is a noctuid moth. It's got that sort of shape, it's got that sort of square, elongated shape, it's a noctuid moth, and they'll go to their books and they'll try and work it out, and they'll fail to find anything, and they'll scratch their heads a bit, and then they'll go back to the books and they'll stare a bit longer, and they'll fail to find it, and eventually they'll give up in disgust and say, we can't possibly do these moths, they don't look like anything in the book. But this is a wax moth, which I notice I've not actually put the scientific name on a notifier, so I will do that as I'm talking. Give me a second. And this is a moth. This is in fact not a moth in the noctuid moths, which people might think it is. It's in fact a moth in a different family, in the Pyralidae family. And it is typing as I speak. I'll put the scientific name up there. There we go. Galleria melonella, wax moth. And this is a species that is known to our beekeepers. We don't have beekeepers on the reserve at the moment because it's a nature reserve and bees are essentially agricultural species, but honeybees are agricultural species. But this is known to beekeepers. If you know beekeepers, certainly here in Europe, and I think in quite a large part of the rest of the world as well, they will know this species because the larvae of it feed on the comb of honeybees. I think they can also eat the grubs of the honeybees, and beekeepers hate these and view them as a bit of a pest, a bit of a nuisance. But it is a perfectly valid part of the ecosystem, and of course its ecological function in a state of nature would be to be eating away at those old discarded combs and clearing out the hollow spaces and freeing them up. But for beekeepers who are looking after their bees and wanting to get a maximum honey crop, of course, anything like that is a problem for them. So they dislike them, they kill the larvae when they see them. It's a common species, so I wouldn't worry about that. Right, coming to another rather attractive species. Again, this is one that is a common species. We're not really seeing anything that's particularly rare in any of these. And of course, that's often the way common things are, by definition, commoner than rare things. But this is a green carpet, Colostidia Pectina, Taria. Do you find pronounced Pectin Taria? I guess that's it. This is a reasonably fresh specimen of this. Quite often the green coloured species fade rather quickly. The green colour seems to fade rather quickly and goes pale, goes yellower, and loses this green colour. This isn't the absolute freshest. It could be a brighter green than this, but this is a reasonably fresh one because it's got quite a lot of that green coloration still going on. And in a few days' time, if this same specimen was out and about, it would have faded to a much paler yellowy colour. Still kept those dark cross lines. It would still be distinct. You'd still be able to tell what it is pretty easily, but it would lose the green coloration. There's something about many of the green coloured moths that does seem to happen, that they do seem to lose the green coloration, fade quite quickly, become quite pale. So let me take that one off and have a look at what we've got next. The order here is pretty much random. The order is basically the order I fished them out of a bag and took photographs in. I did think about organising these into family groups and doing a systematic going through of the different families, but this is more like what it's like fishing things out of the trap. They don't come in a they don't arrange themselves in any systematic order when you're surveying them. You just look at them as they come. So that's what we're doing here to give that. And that's definitely a deliberate choice I made to carefully give the authentic experience and not me just being too lazy to carefully sort the moths into an order for you all. So here is another one in the Geometridae, or the geometer moths, or the inchworm moths, as they're sometimes called. And this one is called the riband wave, Idaea aversata. Probably another one of the commonest moths that we get, and one that has quite an extended flight season of overlapping broods throughout the year. So we see this for quite a lot of the year. It has two forms. This is what's called the typical form, which has this dark bar across the middle of the wing, which you can hopefully see there running across the wing. And there is another form called form remutata, in which that dark central bar is not filled in. So it's essentially just got the two lines above and below it, but without the bar filled in. And here, at least, that form remutata is more common than this typical form of the moth. This is riband wave. It's a fairly common species again. Now, I'm getting told I've got a very poor signal strength at the moment, but hopefully the photographs, because they're uploaded to HAP's server, are coming through, even if I look like a very blurry bunch of pixels to you. So the next moth which I will put on the screen here. This is a moth which is the forwing characteristics of this are quite variable. And usually when I first see one of these in the year, when I first get to the season when this species is out, I think I found something really exciting that I've not seen before. It tends to trick me every year. And then I get hold of myself and remember that I always make this mistake. And this is a species called the straw underwing, Phthalophilia matura. The forewing pattern can be quite variable in colour and intensity of markings, but it always has this straw-coloured hindwing, this yellow straw-coloured hindwing. You can just see off to the right of the image a little bit of that straw-coloured hindwing poking out from behind the forewing. But this is again a species that often tricks me. I often when I first get one of these in the year, think I found something much more exciting, and then remember that it's this. There are one or two species that do that to me every year. That every year when I get one, I think, wow, and then I realise no, it's a common something I've seen many times before, and that I've just forgotten about. So there we go. We'll take the straw underwing off and we'll go and find the next moth to have a look at. This one that's coming up is perhaps not a welcome species. It's not a welcome species. So this moth is called the oak processionary moth, Thaumetopoeia processionia. And if you're here in the UK and you read the more alarming press, you'll have probably heard horror stories about this moth. And it is a pest species, and it's a pest species because it's a problem for human health. It can also be quite damaging to the trees. It can be quite damaging and defoliating in a really bad year, an oak tree. But the main reason this is viewed as a pest species is that the caterpillars of this have very irritating hairs. If they come into contact with your skin, you'll get a very nasty, very painful rash. And for some people, particularly people who are asthmatic or so on, the caterpillars can also shed their hairs. They can sit in the trees and the hairs can fall off. And if you inhale the hairs, they can cause breathing difficulties. So this is a rather pestiferous species. This is rather a problematic species. Fairly recent arrival in Britain. Don't really know how it arrived here, but it's not thought likely it got here naturally. It turned up first in London. So if it was a natural colonist from mainland Europe where it occurs, it would probably have occurred on the south coast and spread up from there. It appeared in London first. So it's thought it was probably accidentally introduced with some oak trees that were brought in. But it's really spread, it's really expanded. It is pretty widespread over a lot of the southern part of the United Kingdom now. And in some parts where it's not fully established yet, there's a lot of effort that goes into controlling this, monitoring for it. If they seem to be arriving, the government can basically instruct you to spray insecticides onto the trees where this might occur to try and kill it off and try and stop it expanding. This has been recorded here for quite a few years now. I would say the numbers are down on what they were after it had initially arrived. And certainly we know that one of the parasites that feeds on the caterpillars, a fly that feeds on the caterpillars, has arrived here in the United Kingdom. And I have recorded that parasitic fly on the caterpillars of this species around here. So a problematic species, oddly one we probably would rather we didn't have, which I don't often say about the stuff I find in this site. I tend to like finding things, but I suspect we could all have lived with not having discovered this species here. But the oak processionary moth, rather a pest. This is a male. The females are somewhat larger. And then we'll move on to another rather bright and attractive looking moth. Almost fluorescent yellow, this moth. And this one's called the Brimstone Moth. Brimstone's an old name for the element sulfur. And it's bright sulphurous yellow, hence the name. Pistifograptis luteolata is the scientific name. Pretty common moth, and one that's relatively easily disturbed by day. You may well see this just walking around. You may well kick these up out of the grass or out of woodland. Pretty distinctively bright yellow. Once you get your eye in, you'll recognize this if you see one of these on even a fairly brief glimpse. So let's move on. So another one that there is a potential confusion for this, but this is a lesser broad-bordered yellow underwing. The name is really rather a mouthful. It's got lots of bits to it. Lesser broad-bordered yellow underwing. Noctua janthae. It's got a yellow hindwing with a dark border to it, and it is smaller than another species in the genus which has a yellow hindwing with a dark border to it, which is the broad-bordered yellow underwing. So this one is the lesser broad-bordered yellow underwing. There is a much rarer confusion species called the Langmaid's yellow underwing, after John Langmaid, who first noticed it in Britain. Noctua janthae, very similar scientific name, rather unhelpfully. And there are various ways to tell that apart. One of the good indicators is the extent of the dark border on the hindwing, which I did look at on this, and I'm pretty certain this is the commoner, lesser broad-bordered yellow underwing, Noctua janthae. Never actually recorded the rarer species here in Perivale Wood. Right. Few more to go. So what we've got here is a moth that, if you look at that quite closely, it's got obviously that very obvious dark line running across the wing. But where the forewing and the hindwing are, where the forewing ends and where the trailing edge, you might be able to just make out a sort of pinkish patch. And the people who were naming these moths thought that looked like blushing cheeks, so they called this the maiden's blush. The scientific name, the punctaria bit, refers to those spots on the wing, but this is maiden's blush, so called because it looks like it's got those pink blushing cheeks. Another of the really common species, and another one that you can see resting up by day. It'll often rest somewhere quite exposed. So I did actually find one of these earlier today, just wandering about. I came across one, but this was one that came to those light traps I was running last night. And another green-coloured moth. Again, this is a fairly fresh specimen of this species because the green is pretty strong. It's called the light emerald. It's not as dark a green as some of the other moths in the emerald family, but this one is fairly fresh. The markings are fresh. The green is still showing. It hasn't faded to a much paler yellow colour. You can see the brown check marks on the corners of the wings there, and the cross lines quite clearly. So this is again probably one that just came out in the last day or so. Came out from its pupa in the last day or so. Campania marginataria, the light emerald. And again, the ruler shown there is millimeters in length, just to give you a sense of it. Thanks for the award. I couldn't see who gave me that, but I will go to the comments and see that. David. Oh, hello, David. Hello, David. So David, good to have you joining us. David's an astronomer, professor of astronomy, I believe, or professor of astrophysics, possibly, one of those things. And he does a lot of broadcasts on here telling us all about what we can see in the sky at night. So do give David a follow. Of course, David always wants to go out when it's a nice clear night. For moths, you want a nice dark cloudy night with large cloud cover to keep the sky warm and to keep things flying. So we like quite different types of night when we're out at night time, David and I. But there we go. So this is, yes, let's say this is a light emerald, and this will have just come out in the last day or so, I suspect, given how fresh it's looking. And yeah, well, the last of the moths I've got to show you. This is one of the smaller micro moths. I like this species. Put it up the front there. And this is Carcina quercana. Some of the smaller moths, some of the families don't really have English names. They don't really have vernacular names. They just have the scientific names. And that's this one's name. I'm pronouncing it Carcina quercana. It could be Carcina quercana. I'm afraid I should actually know how to pronounce these Latin names, but I'm terrible, I don't. But I'm not sure that the soft C sound occurs in Latin, so it may well be Carcina quercana rather than Carcina quercana or Carcina. Anyway. Species that feeds on oak trees, genus Quercus, which is reflected in the scientific name, Carcina quercana. So yeah, that was some of the species that we observed last night in my light traps here in Perivale Wood. Hopefully this method of doing it by showing the photographs rather than trying to show the live moths helped deal with some of the bandwidth issues. I had a few bandwidth warnings on this as I was going, so that may well have broken up my image, but hopefully the photographs which were uploaded to HAPS have all behaved themselves and been of reasonably high quality. Very smoky here, Dave. Oh, you've got fires out there. Dave, I've been seeing on the news about some parts of America where they're having a lot of problems with fire. Is that affecting you? It's worrying. So what I'll do to end on is I'll just put a few of these images up and switch to a different mode. I wonder how many of these I can get up before HAPS starts telling me off. So let's see if I can break HAPS by putting too many images up. Let's see if it objects. Oh, no, it's still letting me put more of them up. That's it. That's the most moths I'm allowed to have. The most images I'm allowed to have on the screen. Well, let's take off. Let's take off a boring one. That's not very exciting to look at. Put that up. And what else will I take off? I don't need both of those up. And put that up. There we go. So we'll end, I suspect, there. What is a collection of moths called? I'm not sure there is a good collective noun for moths, David. Quite sure what happened there. It may have just disconnected me. But if I'm still here and you can still hear me, that's good. It went quite, yes, it briefly kicked me out when I was trying to do something. So yes, so David asked, what is a collection of moths called? And for some reason, it's not letting me. There we go. I'm not sure there is a name for a collection of moths. I mean, when we have them in a cabinet, we just call them a collection. And when we have the specimens. But perhaps we should make one up. Anyway, it now seems to be playing up a little bit. So I am probably going to end here with this image showing some of the moths that we caught last night, some of the surveys, and I'm going to head home and I'm going to put all of the records, all of the data into a database, and then later in the year I'll make sure that goes on to the various teams that we operate. So I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to sign off now and I will see you all on a future broadcast.